thank you all for coming. This panel, named by Matt Lockyer, is named Lego My Legos, and is largely about how we build composable applications in the blockchain ecosystem and how that differs from the way that blockchain or other applications in the past have been built. And on the panel today, we have a variety of different projects, each of which we think captures a different aspect of what it means for us to have a composable ecosystem, whether that's a dev tooling, whether that's domains, whether that's KYC. So what I'll do maybe first is just go around here and have everyone do a quick introduction. Tell us a bit about just your name, the project, and sort of what you're excited about in sort of 2020 with your own ecosystems. And for myself to start, my name is Scott Moore. I work on the Gitcoin team. We do public goods funding and open source funding, mainly in Web3. And I'm really excited about the future of quadratic funding.
Hi, everybody. I am Brad. I'm co-founder at Unstoppable Domains. We are a blockchain domain registry, and we also build tools for decentralized websites. So the idea is that we want a free and open internet that cannot be censored. We think anybody in the world should be able to publish and say what they want on the internet without censorship. And right now, the current internet has two major points of censorship. One is domains. GoDaddy or whoever your domain registrar is can take your domain away from you. And Amazon Web Services can turn off your website in 5 minutes. And they do, and it happens. So if you move your domain name onto a blockchain and you move your storage onto IPFS or another decentralized storage network, you solve this problem.
Hey everybody, my name is Kevin Seagraves. I'm a founder and head of product at a company called Charge. Big headline is Charge is credit cards that can't be stolen. So thinking about e-commerce and more traditional payments. In this space, we are providing credit cards on the blockchain. So any digital good, whether that's an NFT or a service, you can now fiat in, fiat out, and leverage blockchain values without having to go through all of the rigmarole of UX and buying gas or buying crypto and paying for gas, etc. That's 3 products. So that's a payment processor, that is a user wallet app, and that's a KYC module. So KYC, we think, being a big component that this ecosystem can benefit from as well.
Hi, I'm Yaniv, co-founder at The Graph. We're an indexing and query protocol for Web3. So we index data from Ethereum, IPFS, and make it really easy to query that data using GraphQL. So we launched a hosted service over a year ago, and we've got really cool projects using it in production, like Uniswap, DAOstack, Aragon, Moloch, Gnosis, a bunch of others. And we're going to be launching our decentralized network later this year.
Hi, I'm Brantley Millegan. I'm Director of Operations for the Ethereum Name Service. ENS is a nonprofit, open source, community-driven naming project. We also do, you have one name for all of your cryptocurrency wallets that also can't be censored, very similar to Unstoppable Domains. We also support IPFS websites, Swarm websites, Tor.onion addresses, arbitrary information with text records, even DNS records. We're looking to bring the same security to DNS records as well. We are integrated in over 100 wallets and dApps, and that's what we're doing.
Carson Farmer, I'm with Textile.io, and we develop developer tools on top of IPFS and other decentralized technologies. We provide a bunch of protocols and database tooling and libraries across desktop, server, browser, mobile, and across languages, Go and JavaScript and Rust and other things. And the goal is basically to make it easier for developers to develop Web3 technologies, particularly on top of IPFS, to the point where you can use IPFS without really having to know that you're using IPFS or anything particularly fancy. And that's what we do. Oh, and I'm excited about the explosive growth of development that I think we're going to see over the next couple of years. due to a lot of the tool building and building block success that we're seeing over the last couple of, years, but even just months. So, there you go.
Awesome. So we want to, I think, maybe give some context here for the audience on like what we mean by, and I gave a bit of this earlier, but like what we mean by composability, what we mean by like the idea of building blocks in the first place. So for you, maybe just we can go around, or anyone who has like a particular opinion on this. First off, what does it mean for something to be composable? What does it mean to be a building block in Web3 versus in sort of the traditional software Web2 ecosystem? And how do you feel like that approach is enhancing Web3 over and above how that's changed in Web2? So, for example, obviously back in the early 90s, being able to build on a you would pretty much build everything from scratch. Then we got like the Node.js ecosystem, we got package managers, we got all these things that made it a lot easier to, I think, kind of work within an ecosystem that's already built for you. How does that apply in your context, in your sort of ecosystem?
Is there a sound person in here, by the way? I don't know is it coming through this? It's not, okay, because it's hard for us to hear what he's saying.
Yeah, it is a bit. I can't really, hear you too well actually either.
Maybe you guys can hear it. We can't hear very well.
Yeah.
You're just talking about like...
Yeah, you probably heard me okay, so we can start there, and then maybe you'll get context from there.
Yeah, you can just copy me. So the question was around like how you think about extensibility and building blocks in Web3 versus Web2. So for us, a domain name is a key part of a website. It's a key part of a website in Web2, as is in Web3. So domain names are just relevant to every application. In fact, if you're a DApp and you're building, trying to build censorship-resistant tools or whatever, they're not fully censorship-resistant if you don't have your domain name on a blockchain and if you don't have your content on IPFS or somewhere else like that. Something that we just launched here, actually, and you may see some flyers, is an IPFS template marketplace. So we want IPFS developers to be able to sell their wares on our website. We have 200,000 domains registered. We have around 20,000 users. They have high intent to build an IPFS website because they just bought a blockchain domain name. And so we're in the process of integrating tools, and that's going to be way easier than it would be in Web 2. Web 2, you'd have Shopify Marketplace, you'd have an application process, you'd have setting up with credit card operators, all of that sort of stuff. Now you can just make a pull request to an open source repo, we accept, you can take Ether, you can take DAI, you can get paid. It's way easier. So I think from our perspective, it's going to be way easier to have developer marketplaces and all the stuff's just sort of connecting together.
Yeah, so I think a building block, from my perspective, is really, it's an abstraction, right? So it's making things easier to either use or implement. So whether that's building a easier to use interface for IPFS, so you have a CLI command that's now creating distributed storage, or that's abstracting away like private keys. Like so, our wallet tech, we have an SDK that now you can. You make some simple calls, integrate with our platform, and now you can actually have a self-custodied and recoverable private key that's completely abstracted away from the user, so they don't know they're using blockchain, but they can leverage value propositions of blockchain. So just as an example, so it's really that abstraction.
So composability is all about reuse, right? So as a developer, you don't have to build everything from scratch. You can just pick up ready-made components. In JavaScript, I think there's really good reuse of code already, and in other ecosystems as well. But what we don't have is really great reuse of data, right? So the way that you do reuse of data and composability in Web 2 is over APIs. And the problem is you have to depend these APIs that you're using. So every time you want to use an API, you have to decide, do I trust this company to continue to be around, to manage that service the way that I want, that agrees with my community, and you're taking on a lot of risk. And so I think the composability that we're seeing that's new with Web3 is composability around reusable data and services, so that it's actually the instance of the networks that we're building, the liquidity, all of these things that are also shared and reusable across services in a dependable way.
Yeah, so I mean, there's different meanings of composability here. I think to some degree, I think what my understanding of what people mean by composability in the Ethereum space is you have different like DApp protocols that are smart contracts on Ethereum that can interact with each other permissionlessly, right? So I can build a DApp, some set of smart contracts that interacts with someone else's set of smart contracts without even talking to them, without having to know them. I can even take this smart contract and connect it to this one and build these things together into a smart contract system. And a great thing about ENS, of course, is it's on Ethereum, so it has all the benefits of composability. Your names on ENS are ERC 721 NFT compliant, so it fits right into any NFT marketplace or system right away. You can also have contracts own ENS names and do things to things automatically. This also creates interesting situations that are not possible on the traditional DNS system. For example, you can have names that nobody owns, so you can actually register a name, set up the records, and then give control to a contract that now it owns it, but the name still functions. That's an incredible thing. You can have names automatically, let's say, change ownership or change their resolver or change their contract based on other events on Ethereum, even that have nothing to do with naming. I think that is a fascinating kind of revolutionary feature. So ENS being on Ethereum benefits from all that composability.
Yeah, I mean, talking about, I think usually I think about composability at a pretty broad level. And your example of sort of the NPM, well, that's a highly centralized system, but the fact that we have all of these modules that can be combined in ways that the original developers couldn't possibly have imagined, and in fact, you know, there's no point in imagining. That's the whole point of tool building and block building, is that the ultimate thing that you build with it, you know, it's an endless sort of possibilities. But one of the sort of important things to keep in mind, I think, in terms of sort of reinforcing composability and reinforcing the reuse of your projects, is designing interfaces and designing tooling that really makes it so that you can't, you know, the sort of example of Web 2 APIs that could just shut down any day. You know, when we have sort of immutable ledger-based data sets that you know are going to be there, I could decide, you know what, I'm actually not going to update to a new version or worry about any. I'm going to stick with this immutable, well-established, you know, version 2, and you know my product works really well. I never have to sort of change how my tooling that I've built on top of that. I don't need to worry about it going away. I don't need to worry about it upgrading under my feet. I don't need to worry about someone removing their package from NPM because it's there, it's immutable, and it's backed up in a nice way. And so that's, you know, that's an assurance that you cannot possibly have without Web3 technologies. And you know, for our team, we get really excited about all the cool things that people are re-implementing in Web3, but we get really excited about the things that people are building in Web3 that they couldn't have possibly built, you know, last year or 2 years ago, even if they could have thought it up. You know, like that's where things get exciting. Is you couldn't build that until there was a public ledger or an immutable data store to back that up. That's where things get exciting. That's where building blocks get exciting.
Can I do one more point?
Yeah,
so
of course.
about just like the ERC standard process, I think it's actually a really valuable composability feature set of the Ethereum ecosystem. Like the fact that we have ERC20 and that like 600,000 ERC20 contracts exist, like that's a really impressive, successful piece of software that people were able to replicate and create value with. That was just like a plug and play component, right? And like we saw it with when I was on the Gitcoin team building Gitcoin grants, like with 1337, the lead standard doing subscriptions on the blockchain, we now have a sustainable business model that can be re-implemented in dApps that is, you know, it is plug and play, it is composable, and that has a lot of value.
I think that's a really interesting point. Like, so there's a trade-off here in some sense, or maybe it's not necessarily a trade-off. I'd be curious to get everyone's perspective on this, between having really strong standards and having these composable kind of atomic units, and being able to make kind of on-the-fly changes and iterate on your code base in a rapid way, potentially. So going to the ERC20 standard, again, like there is definitely a really big benefit to having that. And at the same time, it does restrict how we're able to use tokens, especially given that most of them are ERC20. in the Ethereum ecosystem in particular. So how do you view those trade-offs with your own products, and how do you see that evolving in sort of the coming years?
Well, we think the standards are important. So we use ERC 721 tokens. All domains are ERC 721 tokens because that's what's already supported in a lot of apps. So, and there's a lot of other companies using it. So it was kind of a no-brainer for us to do that. So we think it would be a little bit hard to innovate on a standard if we're focused on ecosystem integrations and connecting in. So it was an easy decision for us.
I think it's hard to start with standards. If you could always just develop perfect software the first time, then it would be easy. But sometimes I see people try to start there where they try to get 4 or 5 teams together. Hey, let's collaborate on a standard. Everybody wants to pull in a different direction, and you're always talking and you're never shipping. And I think sometimes we take the track of why don't you just launch something, see how it does, learn from it, and once it proves itself, then you could have a conversation about, okay, this seems to be a really good way to do it. Can we kind of start to standardize on something that's working?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely very much something that's on the mind of our team is, the sort of the exciting thing is like, let's design this thing so that it does everything that we're going to need and everything we're going to need in the future too. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're like, can I design an interface that is sufficiently generic that it's useful and that I can upgrade it or build something else on it moving forward, but that I can actually use tomorrow and that people are going to play around with and enjoy it. And like, there are certain ways to be super pragmatic about that. Using like graph-based structures and things like that are very nice because they're very flexible, but it doesn't work for all situations. So being sort of very pragmatic about just getting something that works, iterating on it quickly, this is how tokens actually do become a standard, is because there was actually quite a bit of iteration. There were quite a lot of proposals that preceded what we sort of end up standardizing on as an industry. So I think that's 100%. Right now we're at the sort of very exciting wild west of Web3, and the best thing to do is play around, find out what works, and establish sub-communities of standardization and push those forward. And I think that's what we're doing, and I think we're doing a pretty good job of it.
Awesome. So each of you have, I think, very distinct applications, with the exception on the stage of 2 domain name services, Unstoppable Domains and ENS. So just in the interest of giving clarity for the audience, do you have, maybe just give a minute to describe sort of why you made the design choices you have with each of your sets of tools, and how you see your role in the ecosystem, not necessarily relative to each other, but just through your own internal design choices?
Yeah, so I think in general, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the competition here is the traditional DNS industry, which is .com, 50 billion plus. Anything that's happening in the blockchain world is relatively small. Also in the traditional world, you have lots of different registries, so it's very likely that you're going to see more than one company, more than one registry, more than one player. And as long as it's interoperable, I don't really see why that would be a detriment. I guess, sort of in relation to us versus ENS. So we actually built the first version of our app as a demo app on ENS, and we decided to build our own registry to solve, I would say, 2 main problems. One is that we think that subscriptions, which exist in the traditional DNS world, are unnecessary. So, you have a blockchain asset, you don't have to pay a subscription on it. There's no opportunity for it to be taken away from you for any reason. And subscriptions have an attack vector. So the registry can raise the prices, or somebody can lean on the registry to raise the prices, like a government. And in the traditional world, this has happened a lot. .com has jacked up their prices, .org 3x their prices. So the risk on the subscription side to a user, if you have a domain name, especially if you have one that is meant to have a censorship-resistant website that might piss people off, you wouldn't want to have subscriptions. So it's unnecessary in the blockchain world. It exists because there's a centralized party in the traditional world to pay the subscriptions. So we eliminated that. And then the other thing is around making sure that domain names get to the right people. So you have this problem in the traditional world around brands and brand protection. So let's say you have Coinbase, Coinbase.com. Coinbase has established itself as a brand, You wouldn't want a scammer or somebody else to get that domain. So there's a kind of big process in the traditional domain name world to make sure that companies can claim their domains first. This was not done with .eth, and so there's a whole bunch of people that own company names. So we went through a process of validating trademarks and trying to make sure that those brands get those domains and they can't be registered by anybody else. Once you have the domain, it's self-custody, but we try to be pretty careful about who we distribute the domain to in the first place so that we don't wind up with a namespace that has a bunch of phishing and stuff like that.
Great. So yeah, I'll respond to some of those things, our perspective on that, and I'll mention some other things as well. The first thing you said, annual fees. So I disagree. I think actually the primary purpose of annual fees is anti-squatting. So if you have just one payment up front and then no ongoing fee, that original payment is a sunk cost, and so it has no anti-squatting effect at all. In fact, I would say if that's your philosophy, you have little need for fees to begin with. Your fees could actually be very low just to register the one time. So the reason we have ongoing fees is because it's an anti-squatting mechanism. We want it, if you're not using the name, if you're not getting value out of it, release it. Let somebody else use it. Free up the names. In terms of the security problem, our solution to that, in terms of, could you forget to renew it or something like that, is that you can renew ahead as much as you want. So if you want to have it for 5 years, so let's say it's $5 a year for most names. If you want it for 1 year, it's $5. If you want it secured for 5, then it's 25. Or if you want it for 100 years, which is basically forever, right? That's $500, so you have to pay more for that. So there's an incentive that, okay, are you really going to get value out of this or not? So that's our reasoning there. In terms of the namespace, that's true. In terms of .eth, for names that were 7 characters and greater, we didn't have a sunrise period. We had an auction system. At that time, that was decided that was the most fair way to go about doing it. For shorter names, we did have a short sunrise period, although we didn't completely reserve trademarks indefinitely. Our philosophy about that is that .eth is primarily going to be used in the blockchain community by Ethereum dApps. That most brands aren't going to be concerned about it. And in fact, the way that we're expanding the namespace on our system is that we're integrating the existing DNS namespace. So we have .eth as sort of a demonstration of the full capabilities of a blockchain native name. And I think the blockchain community is most interested in that. But you can get most of, but not all, but most of the benefits if you just use your DNS name on ENS. We already have that with .xyz, .lux, .cred, .art, and .club, and we're going to be rolling that out to the full DNS namespace here very soon. So what that means is if you have Brantley.com, pretty soon you will be able to send Bitcoin to Brantley.com, and it will be using ENS and Ethereum in the background. And like I said, that will work on the over 100 dApps and wallets that we're integrated in. And the last point I want to make, and I think this is another kind of fundamental difference in our strategy, is our approach to the traditional DNS space and industry. Our approach is we don't want to fight it. We want to upgrade the tech stack for DNS. We don't want to challenge the processes that have been built up over the last 2 to 3 decades for the management of that namespace. We want to respect that. We think that's best for users. We also think that it's most likely to succeed. And I think that's not an approach that Unstoppable Domains has been taking. But
awesome. I have a lot of questions there, but I will leave them as we only have a little bit of time left. So I want to maybe just jump to Yaniv for a minute. You talked about, obviously, the graph is very much focused on trying to provide data availability. How do you see your approach to data availability differing from what's existed in Web 2, and what maybe exists with other projects in the space? And what do you see as sort of like the most interesting use cases for the graph today?
So I don't exactly think of us as a data availability solution. I think of the underlying networks that we support as the data availability layers.
Sure.
And then we're like indexing that data and making it efficiently available to applications. So, as far as composability, there's a lot of extra work that you need to do to make data readily available to an application, to index it, to organize it, so that you can just run a query and get back whatever data you want really quickly. So that work, before the graph came along, people were writing a lot of custom code. And in Web3, that to me is kind of like a code smell where you say, hey, this is supposed to be dependable infrastructure that we can all use, and there's thousands of lines of code that's sitting on some server somewhere that somebody wrote in a hurry and deployed, and I'm supposed to depend on that. So what we did was we kind of standardized that process with this abstraction called a subgraph that defines how to index some portion of the graph and then make it available as an open, decentralized, permissionless API. And what we hope is that more and more data is going to move to Web3, and in a decentralized way, all of the developers around the world can collaborate on curating these decentralized APIs, coming to agreement on schemas for how that data should be organized and queried and linked to each other, so we can have a global graph API on top of all of this Web3 data that'll just make it way easier for developers to build applications.
Awesome. One question just on dev tooling versus composability. So for me, I see dev tooling is like a fundamental good. It seems like, I think to me it seems like much more tangibly beneficial in both Web 2 and Web 3, whereas we see composability being, I think, discussed more actively in Web 3 context principally. How do you see dev tooling as, I guess, distinct from Web 2 into Web 3, and how do you approach that in the IPFS ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think in a lot of cases, dev tooling is really just building. It ends up building bridges from sort of existing Web 2 technologies onto Web 3 platforms. So a big example is I don't know how many of the dApps that are built here are built either using React or Vue or something like that. These are frameworks that people like, that work really well. There are a lot of investment in dev tooling that went into that, but the way that those applications are deployed are very much designed for a Web 2 like address or location-based addressing type system. So we were just having a conversation about 30 seconds before this panel started about someone who was trying to deploy a Vue app onto IPFS, and the whole thing sort of fell flat on its face because there are sort of fundamentally different ways of referencing information and data on the web, and there are ways to work around that. So a big piece of like building Web 3 dev tooling is just building Web 3 native tooling that is designed to work with content addressing, is designed to work with data that needs to maybe be synced before it could be processed, or data that is already distributed, and so those those tools need to be designed so that they can actually be deployed and send information back, or do some of the indexing locally. So a lot of that sort of developer tooling, a lot of things that we spend time on are trying to make sort of native Web 3 technologies either work on top of existing Web 2 stacks, or just say, look, we're not doing that anymore. That's not, we can actually build a better product by just focusing on native Web 3 technologies. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that.
And just one like definition that I'd like to kind of put out there is the difference between developer tools and infrastructure. Right, so there's a lot of developer tools, which is really about making it easier to build applications, and that's really important, and we need a lot of that. And sometimes I see confusion between that and infrastructure, which I think of as being what the software actually runs on. And so, dev tools, I think it's really fine if it's not like decentralized, or a lot of times, it can just be a local CLI, it can be some SaaS product that you're using, and that's okay. Whereas for the infrastructure, that's where it's really important that it's running on a decentralized network so you don't have these single points of failure.
So I really wanted to ask one last question the idea of KYC in this ecosystem. I think we're just out of time though, and I want to just maybe do one quick round of like, and this maybe tie into that, what you're most excited about in 2020 for your particular projects and for the ecosystem at large, and then maybe we can also figure out a way to talk about KYC in context very briefly. So just maybe like 10 seconds, 20 seconds each.
So we're most excited about real decentralized websites. And we think 2020 is the year where it's going to happen. There's a lot of people building interesting stuff on IPFS. We're seeing the tooling get better. We're seeing the apps get better. So we think that the world's going to be able to get a peek at what the decentralized web actually looks like in 2020. And I don't think that was really true in prior years.
I'm really excited about usability. So we started out our thesis of how can we make this easier for normal people to leverage goods and services on a blockchain. So using a credit card is a really good UX. People are familiar with that. In order to interface with this traditional financial system, but still leverage value props of the blockchain, we have to use KYC. So where we have cryptographically signed credit cards, moving that value onto a blockchain via the settlement system, leveraging buying NFTs or perhaps a grant or a bounty on Gitcoin, and knowing who the customer is the ultimate beneficiary with KYC product.
I think 2020 is going to be the year that Web3 really becomes real. So there's a lot of really exciting new protocols that are going to be launching, and both in terms of underlying protocols and applications. I think we're going to see a lot of exciting products launch and get traction.
Yeah, I'm also excited about the large growth of the decentralized web, which we already have a lot of the pieces in ENS. We already have a search engine. We already have multiple browser integrations. We already have lots of websites using our system and IPFS. So we already have that, and I think that's going to explode this year. We also have some new things coming out in that. Also, full DNS namespace integration to work on ENS. Very excited about that.
I think we're most excited about the fact that the last few years have seen a lot of rapid development and sort of tools maturing. And I think 2020, the thing we're really excited about is all of these building blocks are now at the point where we can actually start using each other's building blocks and sort of really explosive growth of that. So, half the people on this panel, I want to have a meeting with them afterwards, say, hey, look, I really want to build this, let's do it. And I think that's 2020 is the year where that's really, we're comfortable with our tools that we built, and we want to just start using them.
It's been years in the making.
Awesome. Love the optimism. Thank you so much, everyone. Cheers. Have a great one.
Thanks, everybody.
And enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the panels.